Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Anglo Election Insights, where today I'm actually answering a comment from a viewer in my last video who asked if it could get any worse for the Liberals. And I decided I would take that comment at face value, focus purely on the Liberals, and make a video that explored which seats that they won this time that might not necessarily be safe in future cycles, despite 2025 being such a low tide year for the Liberals. So we'll explore a few sort of groupings of seats, have a look at some trends which may or may not continue, and try to kind of come up with some potential situations basically where the Liberal Party find themselves still in a hole and unable to improve with certain groups of voters, and where that could play out electorally. But at this point, it's all a bit of a projection. We don't quite know exactly what direction the party will take in future cycles, but we're going to have a chat about it anyway. So, starting with the Liberal brand. Now, Susan Lee has obviously won the leadership of the party, and she seems to be wanting to return it a little bit more to that sort of Turnbull era, modern Australian Liberal Party. I'm a little bit sort of concerned that this could alienate their core conservative base and their donor class as well. And perhaps, as a lot of these sort of conservatives would argue, the return on investment in terms of winning back some of these perhaps more like economically liberal voters is quite small. I think they've well and truly left the party over some of their socially conservative stances, some of their environmental policy and energy policy over the years. I'm just not sure that these kinds of voters are ready to come back. Regardless, as I said, this is where this video I'm going to try and identify some trends that we saw take place over the last couple of cycles and see if some of them could continue and result in the Liberals losing further seats. It doesn't necessarily mean that the Liberals couldn't win back other seats, but this is just looking at where potential further losses could occur. So the first type of seat is your sort of affluent, diverse seats where there's a high percentage of families. And there are two big examples that I've found. Firstly, we've got Bawa and Mitchell in Sydney's northwest. So these seats have like an affluent, diverse population, particularly with concentrations of South Asian and Southeast Asian populations. So think Indian and Chinese Australians, those two communities were real pain points for the coalition, particularly in this election just gone. And a lot of them have families, but they're affluent, they have social mobility, and therefore, unlike voters in a place like Wirrawa, or maybe Scullin, where the cost of living was really biting and the absence of kind of new infrastructure was starting to turn voters against Labor. The Liberals weren't benefiting from that at all here, and it was the focus on the foreign policy of the Liberals and their sort of hawkish stance on China and their continued inability to really make any sort of connection with these types of communities, and sort of ongoing frustration with how the Liberals saw Australia's role in the Asia Pacific, and some of the Trump politics kind of come into it here as well. I think that is just continuing to alienate people in these seats, and they were once very safe and now not so much. And I don't see why that trend wouldn't continue if the Liberals sort of continued on that current course. But we could see Susan Lee sort of pull them out of that course. They might actually kind of listen to this election review, although I get the feeling that this election review is going to end up like all those like bushfire royal commissions. They all say the same thing and it never really gets done. So we'll see, but those are definitely two seats that I'll be looking out for if the Liberals don't show much of a sign of improvement. So the second type of seat that I'm looking at is your kind of aspirational outer suburbia. So this isn't sort of your Wirrawas or Whitlams, or Hawke even, those kind of lower socioeconomic seats where the Liberals hadn't won before and they were looking to pick up new voters. These are seats that they hold. Some of them have been swing seats in the past, but the Liberals or the Liberal Nationals have kind of consolidated their hold over them recently, but they're not necessarily safe. So they're a little bit more blue collar in general, but there is some social mobility. They're not low income seats, and they do have that kind of mortgage belt character. And the seats that I've picked here, they don't have that same sort of diverse cultural and linguistic diversity that somewhere like a Mitchell, or even on the other end of the spectrum a Hawke or a Wirra is going to have. These are your sort of more kind of white middle Australia seats, I guess. So Lindsay and Longman, the Liberals came within a hair of losing Longman. Lindsay, has become quite marginal now, and Casey still remains like a 3% seat. I do note that they actually increased their margin here slightly, the Liberals, but that it might have been that in reality the seat is quite marginal, and the loss of the personal vote from 2022 of Tony Smith, is that his name? I forget. He his personal vote was probably quite significant. So it might have been that had it been the same member who contested from 1922-25, we would have seen like more of a gradual decline in the Liberal margin there. So I think for this to play out, Labor probably needs to have a really good term, and the Liberals again need to have a bad campaign where they don't really get their message through to middle Australia, which is exactly what happened in 2025. And if Susan Ley is going to continue to kind of aim for this sort of more affluent modern Australian audience, and go after your sort of professional female voters, that sort of thing, if that's the way that they go, then if Labor have a good term, they might find that people just continue to park their vote with Labor. So I just want to mention here Latrobe, which kind of fits into its own category, or has a bit of type 1, bit of type 2. So yes, it has high its diversity is quite high, but it's not high income the same way that Mitchell or Bawa are, but it's not like low socioeconomic necessarily. Although, it's been a while since I've been down to Pakenham. Things might have changed a little bit since the census in 21. It's a growth corridor, very sort of mortgage belt, and you've got a lot of families. So as you can see, it kind of combines a bit of 1 and 2. And I think here, a couple of points worth mentioning. Firstly, Jason Wood, his personal vote is known to be quite high. So if the Liberals were to lose that in a future cycle, and perhaps also if that sort of simmering anger at the state government wasn't present in a future cycle, that could be the kind of election scenario where Latrobe flips back. It has flipped before, I think it was 2010. So definitely want to keep an eye on in the future. So the third type of seat, and I touched on this in my last video in terms of the teal threat, is these retiree havens. So these are seats that are at least loosely within the metropolitan sphere. There are large retiree populations, but you don't have primary industry. So unlike a seat like Cowper, where there's a lot of, like ex-Sydney boomers retiring up there, but there's still like a blue collar population. There's still a lot of, the local economy is still very driven by tourism, but also some primary industry. You don't have that in these seats, and in fact what you do have is local kind of community activist groups who are quite sort of concerned with the natural environment of the place. You have a lot of tourism operators, you have a lot of small businesses, and perhaps you also have less and less of people who only sort of spend the summer in some of these places. I think you now have maybe higher proportions of permanent residents, and that's changing the demographics a little bit. And as a result, I think we're seeing some of these seats trend away from the Liberals over the longer term. So in particular, Forrest, Flinders and Fisher, as mentioned in my last video, could be potentially challenged by Teals, and in fact a couple of them did come very close in the election just gone. Meanwhile, in Fairfax and McPherson, it was actually Labor that significantly reduced the Liberal margins there, or LNP I should say. But a viewer did let me know that in McPherson, in some of the sort of hinterland areas, that some of the conditions that I was describing in seats like Forrest, Fisher and Flinders are actually present, and maybe another run from a Climate 200 Teal could actually be successful too. But the point is the Liberals could come under pressure in these sorts of seats. So the final seat is where the Nationals might challenge the Liberals. I think this is probably more specific to seats where the Nationals don't form part of the federal coalition, and WA kind of makes the most sense here. The SA Nats had no real luck in Grey when they contested, and I mean, we'll see. Maybe the Tassie Nats could do something in this upcoming state election, and that might sort of inspire them to challenge for seats like Braddon and Bass. But I think the evidence is behind a potential run from the Nationals on seats like Durack and O'Connor. Now, these two seats didn't get much attention, but the Nats actually polled reasonably well, like in the sort of low mid teens, I think, and that was without, the big Mia Davies Bullwinkle campaign. They had none of the same attention or anything like that, and the Nats at the state level did actually win a couple of the underlying state seats as well, some of them against the odds, specifically a seat like Albury, maybe Geraldton as well. But the one caveat here is that the live sheep trade export issue probably isn't going to be there going into the next election. So yeah, the Nats are going to have to move on from a sort of more agrarian and agricultural, rural type message to something that is maybe going to appeal more to other sort of primary industry people and blue collar workers on the whole. I'm not sure exactly how they would do that, but it is definitely something that's on the cards if Susan Ley is going to take the Liberals off in a more kind of metropolitan focused direction, I would say. So the one other fact that I just wanted to mention here, and we know that kind of trying to infer a federal voting intention from The Voice is a fatal error on the part of Liberal internal pollsters, for example, but it does make for an interesting point here. So what I've done is I've coloured in the seats with the potential challenger. So the red is obviously Labor, then you've got the Teals and the Nats, and then here on the right, these boxes are coloured by green are the seats that voted more yes than the rest of the nation, and orange more no. So obviously the Voice got defeated in a landslide, so the midpoint is like a 40% yes vote. But it does make for interesting reading when you see what seats went more yes than the rest of the nation, I think. So the one that sticks out, of course, is Barowa, which a lot of people did mention nearly voted yes overall. That maybe had something to do with Julian Leeser, the local member, campaigning for The Voice as well. But it does show that even despite, in a lot of these seats with sort of more diverse populations, they tend to be a bit more socially conservative. They voted no in large numbers, but that didn't play out so much in Barowa, but it did in Mitchell, for example. You can see some of these seats that have more kind of Anglo populations, like Casey, Flinders, they were a little bit more on the yes side, but compared to the nation. But then other seats with sort of higher numbers of diverse voters, you think Lindsay, not so well, and then some of the seats with really a lack of diversity. Longman comes to mind. Obviously really low percentage of yes voters. So just a different angle. Just something that kind of shows that it doesn't really matter necessarily how socially conservative or progressive these seats are. They're all not necessarily safe for the Liberals, regardless of how they voted on the voice referendum. So that's about it for this one. Thanks for watching, guys. Please subscribe to the channel if you're new. You haven't already. Please like this video if you enjoyed it. And I'll be continuing to cover the Tasmanian election. We've had, I think, the close of nominations. So we have the full candidate list. I think Paul Blodge is going to go live with his election guide very soon. And I'm waiting out to see if we're going to get any more polling as well, so that we get a bit of an idea of what's happening. Perhaps later in the week I'll have a look there. But thanks for watching, guys. Hope you enjoyed it. I realise that a lot of you guys are not big supporters of the Liberals on this channel, so just thought I'd indulge you a little bit. But yeah, hope you enjoyed it, and have a good day.